Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire's Business of America podcast with your host, Jerry Rogers.
Welcome to another edition of the Business of America. And what we do here is very special. It's unlike other podcasts, other radio shows, in that we bring on the doers, those who are in the arena, Teddy Roosevelt, the arena of the men and women who make America work, entrepreneurs, public servants, ranchers, and we're going to talk about that today, and everyone in between, scientists, innovators, manufacturers, etc. The men and women who make America work. We don't talk enough about the men and women who make America work, and so I'm happy to do that today. We have with us a public servant, a farmer, an entrepreneur, a banker, a rancher, and a granddad who's now in Colorado. He said to me last week he's raising bison and grandkids. And I'm so happy to introduce former congressman from Colorado, Bob Beauprez. Did I say that right?
You said it perfectly. Very nicely done.
Now, of course, I'm familiar with who you are, Congressman. I'm a political guy, and I remember when you served. However, by looking at your name, I think you'd be from Louisiana, though, not Colorado.
Well, understandably, I get that a lot. Either that, or maybe Montreal. It's a Belgian name actually, with a Z on the end. The Frenchman would not have the Z, and you see a lot of that. If you do happen to check the phone book in Montreal, you'll see a lot of Beauprez there, but those true Frenchmen without the Z. I didn't realize the Z was a Belgian additive until I was quite old myself.
Well, one thing I know for certain about you, and that is you are Colorado through and through. You're born, raised, schooled, and you served in Washington for a time, but then went back to Colorado. Do me a favor. Let's tell our viewers, our listeners, a little bit about your career, where you started, and how we got here today.
Well, thanks, Jerry. I come from farming stock, fifth generation Coloradan on my mom's side, third on my dad's side, and all farmers. My grandfather, Beauprez, came here straight from Belgium about 1907. Had not been a farmer. He was, I guess you could say in his own way, he was an entrepreneur in Belgium. His wife would weave lace, famous Belgian lace, in their little home, and he would put it in a sack and walk from town to town and sell it in what we would call flea markets or farmers markets. He was still a young man, and things were getting pretty tough. It was shortly before the First World War, and thankfully he decided it was time to get out of there. He came to the U.S., eventually got to Colorado after a few years, talked a neighbor into loaning him the money to buy a farm so he could teach himself how to be a farmer, speaking of entrepreneurs. So he did that. My dad followed in his footsteps, one of 8 children my dad was, and the one that was kind of in the right place at the right time when my grandfather needed somebody to look after the farm. I wanted to get away from that stinking farm as fast as I could. So I went to the University of Colorado. I was going to be a football coach and teacher. And about halfway through school, this is in the late 1960s, and it was a pretty crazy time in Boulder, Colorado, like Madison or Berkeley. And I guess maybe that had some effect on me, but that family farm and that family life all of a sudden started looking a little better. So when I graduated from school, I came home and worked with my mom and dad in that dairy farm business. An older brother was also there already, and we did that for about the next 20 or so years. We were in the path of development. I was asked by the families to look after that. It's now a 1,500 housing unit residential golf course community that we're pretty proud of, and I led the charge on that. At the same time, I bought into a little community bank. Bank was pretty sick. Probably should have been, not probably, it should have been closed. It was in real trouble. Just $3 million in assets when we first looked at it. Needed a president. I said, well, I can maybe do that. So I rolled up my sleeves, taught myself how to be a banker, and did that for about a dozen years, grew the bank substantially, turned it over to my wife to look after when I went to Congress. Did the Congress thing, came home, tried to be governor, got the second place trophy for that. Actually tried twice and got two of those trophies, which doesn't get you an office or a business card. Wife and I had long thought, if we ever got to the spot where we could return to the land, we'd love to get a piece of dirt again and kind of go back to our roots. I'd had this fantasy about raising buffalo or bison, same animal. One's a biological name, bison. The other is the name that the first settlers came up with, because that's kind of what they looked like the European or the African Asian buffaloes. Anyway, in 2007, we bought a ranch up in the mountains. One of our sons said, "Dad, you're going to need help." And so he looks after it full time now. I go back and forth and help him out. And we raise about 300 or 400 head of bison. And I tell you, Jerry, I must be the luckiest guy in the world. I've had so many fabulous experiences, and now I've got this place where I tell people only a little bit jokingly that it may not be heaven, but I think I can see it from there. And I'm very much at peace when I'm up there in the mountains and roaming with the buffalo.
Well, that's incredible. And again, what you mentioned this a couple of times, your grandfather teaching himself, you teaching yourself. People think of innovators or entrepreneurs, and our assumption is, or our what our mind or our gut tells us is, well, they're expert in this area. They already know. And in many, many instances, the entrepreneur is someone who's just willing to take the risk, willing to teach himself or herself, willing to go and get a amount of dirt and make it into something, or a small business or what have you. So there's so much there. Let's start with the ranch, if you don't mind. And so it's a buffalo bison ranch. I've been on your website for a couple of days now. I'm hungry. I'm sitting here and I'm hungry. Tell us about what you sell, how it works, and this sort of thing.
Well, we sell both the finished product, that being meat, all the cuts. Just if you think about beef, the carcass is about the same. The musculature is about the same. So you've got all the roast, you've got all the ground, the burger, you've got the ribeyes and the New Yorks and the sirloin steaks, and so on and so forth. We started off by building a little website, branding ourselves Eagles Wing Natural Bison. We decided early on that we wanted to do it just like Mother Nature, so ours are all grass-fed and only grass-fed, that one ingredient diet that just like they had 10,000 years before the white man showed up, and they do fabulously well on it. We don't feedlot them, we don't grain them, and a number of buffalo breeders do that. I'm not trying to shame them, but we just have a very different philosophy of let buffalo be buffalo. It's healthier, to be real candid. But it's an industry that is developing. So just like when I was in the dairy business, Jerry, there's some people that want good seed stock. So we sell some live animals as well to other ranchers to add to their breeding herds or begin a breeding herd. So both live animals, which are highly sought after, as well as the meat that, frankly, the demand greatly exceeds the supply of buffalo. It's a product very much in demand. It's a good red meat, healthy red meat, and there's a good awareness of that.
Let me ask you this. The obstacles, folks talk about inflation, supply chain, economic issues. the last couple, 3 years, post-COVID especially, COVID, the economy shuts down. How has your ranch, how have you fared through COVID, since COVID?
COVID was of little impact to us, fortunately. We're in a very remote part of Colorado. There's only our entire county, and it's a pretty big county, but there's only about 1,500 people in the whole county. We only joke a little bit that there's maybe more moose in Jackson County, high up in the mountains, than there are people. Not a single traffic light in the whole county and no need of one. So it's very remote. And that probably assisted us in at least not having been heavily impacted by COVID. Like everybody else, every other industry, though, a lot of our normal seminars, our sales, consignment sales, where we could sell our animals, farmers markets where we could sell our meat, a lot of those were shut down. But we were left able to still ship meat, which we have done. We ship it frozen. And we've shipped from Hawaii to Connecticut, Florida to Alaska, and most of our market goes right here in Colorado. People pick it up at our home right out of our freezer. So we got through the COVID thing reasonably well. We had some other challenges though.
We talked a little bit before we started the show. I used to be a varsity football coach. In my spare time, which was like 60 hours a week, if anyone knows about coaching. And next to the high school where my daughters went to high school, I was the only coach on the team without a son on the team. I had daughters who went to the school, but in some ways, not having a son on the team is a good thing. But right next door to us was a farm or ranch. Where you could buy beef, and it was right there. It was fresh, and they did good business. There's something I don't want to say romantic, but there's something special about being next to or living among ranches and farms and such things. I still have a family in Ireland. Your family came over. My family came over from Ireland, but a lot of my family went back, and they're dairy farmers. Mostly in Galway. So what's the difference between being a rancher, bison, buffalo, and a dairy farmer? Is there a big difference? Is it same thing, teach yourself and go forward, or are there nuances and such? Or I mean, again, I don't want to be cliche, but are all farmers the same? I tend to think not, but you're the expert.
Well, there's some similarities, and there's some there's some skills that you transfer from one type of farming to the next. Running equipment and building fence and running an arc welder and being personally responsible. All of those things are transferable. The obvious thing different about raising a bunch of buffalo and being a dairy farmer, you don't have to milk the buffalo.
Or God forbid if you try, right?
God forbid if you tried. You're exactly right, Jerry. Yeah, we get a lot of people say, "Well, do you milk them?" I see buffalo cheese, and a different kind of buffalo. That's coming from the water buffalo. You're not gonna milk one of our cows. A much different fencing system. We've got to have more substantial fencing, obviously, for buffalo. They're still a wild animal. Extremely powerful, and they'd make up their mind to go through something, they're going to go through it. So more substantial fencing that in part to hold them in, but also in part so they're not tempted to go through it and injure themselves. The other big lesson, I guess, I would say I learned, I was around cattle, especially dairy cattle, pretty much my whole young adult life, at least from the time I was a little bitty kid up until I was in my mid-40s. So I knew I could raise cattle, and I also knew that you could kind of change cattle's mind. If you want them to go that way, and they'll go. And if you get behind them and make a little noise, they'll go. You can herd them, in other words. Buffalo, you've got to learn patience, and that's something I was necessarily gifted with a lot of patience, and so it was a lesson I had to learn. Buffalo, you kind of have to wait for them to go where you want them to go and then follow. Example, one of the best things we learned was if we want them to change pastures or go in a certain direction, it's best to bait them with a little bit of feed. Make sure that they can start moving in one direction and off they go, rather than chase them. Because if you try to drive them like you do cattle, they're gonna kind of get that this is something we didn't decide to do, and one of them's going to turn around and take off, and the rest of them will follow. So you're done. So,
well, I'm going to ask you a question now that I'm sure our listeners, our viewers are thinking about, because you did serve in Congress, and so I asked about dairy farm and bison or buffalo farming or ranching. What the way you were describing both the herding but also the leading or making sure the buffalo can kind of do what they want sounds a lot like Congress on any given day, but both. So you served. We talked again over the phone last week, and it seems to me that and again, this is cliche, but it's true, and I guess that's why it's cliche. Congress is broken, and there aren't enough committee hearings and amendments and arguments and real debates. And I remember a time when things were different. I remember a time when you could work across the aisle and come up with good legislation and oversight and these sorts of things. Maybe we get back to it. But again, given your experience in business, banking, working the farm, working the ranch, your experience in development and managing property and seeing that go through. How do those experiences match up with or compare to being a member of Congress?
Well, I'm grateful, Jerry. I'll be forever grateful that I had those, I guess we could say, real life experiences, real career experiences before I went to Congress. What I found there, unfortunately, is that there's a tremendous lack of that kind of experience. Not necessarily the same ones I had, but, other than a few doctors and a whole bunch of lawyers, I don't remember very many people that had business experience. I was on the Ways and Means Committee, and you'd think that would be a place where, especially people with a background in economics and real business that could relate to the folks back home. This is the tax writing committee.
Sure.
This is the one in charge of all of our revenue and all of our spending. So it's a big deal. And on that committee, even there was a paltry lack of that hands-on real life experience that you'd like to think you could draw from to make the heavy judgments that are required. It's partly why, Jerry, when I was there, this was after 9/11. It was during the Bush 43 years. Started out shortly after 9/11. We were pretty much together, pulling the wagon, and I mean by we, both parties. But that quickly evaporated, and me, I mentioned earlier that I am not the most patient guy. It's very, very difficult to watch how Congress gets nothing done other than just fight like with each other. We did a lot of that, and I had the opportunity. We had an open governor's seat in 2006, and I thought, governors can actually do stuff. In fact, President Bush told me that. He said, "Yeah, Bob," he says, go home and be a governor if you can. He says you can actually do things for your people, and you can do it day one. I very much wish I'd have had that opportunity. As I said earlier, I came in second on that, but politics is an extremely frustrating business right now, and I wish I had some kind of vision, some kind of thought as to how we repair this thing that's so badly broken right now. But we seem to be polarized on two extreme sides, and the country deserves better than that. We need better than that. But the quickest way, I haven't been there and done it, quickest way to buy yourself a primary or tee off some folks back home is to, God forbid, compromise with the other side.
Right.
And that's the way our system was designed. Is fight like the Dickens for what you truly believe in, but at the end of the day, keep good government and solutions at the forefront of your mind and get the best you can get.
Yeah. It's interesting. I worked for a member of Congress years ago in the 90s, and he represented a swing district from New Jersey. And so by his nature, by his personality, his name was Bill Martini. He was a true kind of New Jersey Republican. He was from his parent, from his family's from Italy. He was working class, and we did a lot of work across the aisle in the 90s. And I remember at the time, Speaker Gingrich had just taken over, and he had the district directors. To your point about what happens in the state, he had the district directors fly in to do a seminar on how to treat and serve your constituents. And I remember two things that the speaker said. One was, this isn't about getting a whole loaf. It's about getting a slice here, a slice there. And I guess Gingrich, he was in the minority for so long. The fact that Republicans were in the majority and at the table, so to speak, was a victory. But the second thing he said was, the state is where the real work is. Home is where the real work is. And you said, the opportunity to run for governor. I'm a despairing optimist. I say this all the time. I have hope for the future. I think things are going to go well. I pray they do. I have 5 children, and I want them to grow up in an America that is there's economic opportunity, there's freedom, they can do what they want, and live their lives. But I'm concerned at the same time. But what does give me hope is I do see governors, I do see state legislators working together and making compromises. Many of the states have to balance their budgets. Now, sometimes they're gimmicks, I get it. But for the most part, they have to work together on budgets. Even in a state like Maryland, where the Democrats are a super majority, they still are forced to, because of local politics and local communities, they try to at least put a bipartisan face on it. What do you make of that, where maybe we should have a rebirth of federalism, where we look at the states to be these instruments of change and reform? Is that something that you see possible?
Well, it's interesting you would bring that up, Jerry. That was one of my principal objectives that I tried to articulate both in 2006 and 2014 when I ran for governor, is I thought we needed that, as you called it, a rebirth of federalism. That's the way the system was designed. You don't have to be a history major or an expert in our constitutional law to read the founding documents and realize that our founders wisely, in my opinion, designed a limited federal government to do what only a federal government could do: a strong military, a unified banking system, and leave everything else to the states. Those innovators, as you rightfully said, that's the laboratory of innovation, is our various states. And if you look around for solutions to how to skin a cat, almost any problem in the public arena that comes up, states will figure it out a lot quicker. They're more nimble. They have the ability to be more creative than our massive federal government, especially in this day and age. But increasingly, what I saw even when I was there, and it's only gotten more so, is the federal government either intentionally grabbing more power or the states actually abdicating more power to the federal government. You do it, feds. It's just upside down from our American character. I think your original premise inviting me on is because I've had some of this experience in life. You learn by doing. You roll up your sleeves. Yeah. I've got to give a lot of credit. Yes, my grandfather, but my dad, 8th grade education. My mom had a 9th, and that's it. But I never, ever in my entire life heard either one of them say, oh, I only wish I had more schooling. I only wish I was better. And then maybe I could do something. They never made an excuse. Yeah. He wanted to get something done. He just went and did it. Built a barn or rented another farm and raised some more feed for our cattle or whatever it was. They just willed themselves to accomplish it. States, I think, that's what, that's to get back to the point. We would do the federal government a big favor. We would do ourselves an even larger favor if we would have that rebirth of federalism, as you spoke of.
And also, and again, you said something that really struck me. My father, now my experience is different than yours. We're from New York City, the Bronx. The Irish came over, Ellis Island, did the whole thing. Yeah. But my father, born in 1938, he's 86 years old. Thank God he's alive and well. My mom, but my dad had to drop out of school in 8th grade because he had to work to help the household. My dad's one of 11. My mom was one of 16. But however, my father, when he left, he got a job with the New York City Transit Authority. However, before that, he was a plumber, taught himself. He worked for a gentleman who had a plumbing business. My father taught himself how to be a plumber. And that's how I was walking down Fifth Avenue once and with my mom and dad, and my father points to this building. He goes, yeah, I laid the foundation for that. I said, I had no idea my father worked on skyscrapers. A plumber, a builder, and later in life, because he had children, a veteran. Later in life, though, because he had children, he took the TA test, the Transit Authority test, and my father retired with an 8th grade education. Now, he went back and got his GED later, but he essentially held a position that today you need to have a doctorate in engineering. Like he would never get this job today. So I think COVID, again, I'm going back to COVID, taught us a lesson that when we're looking for education opportunities, we ought to be looking for opportunities that are going to help us do something, not necessarily go and take a 4-year vacation. I love books. I love history. But it's important to be able to do something too. And, my daughters, I have 4 daughters and a son. One of my daughters is interested in politics, the poor thing. My second daughter is graduating in May, and she's going to be a teacher. And she went to school to be a teacher. And she knows what she wants to do. How should we change or should we, maybe I'm wrong, think differently about how we educate ourselves? Maybe community school is a better option. Maybe be an apprentice is a better option, or trade schools. I mean, this sort of thing, so we can have more ranchers, more plumbers, more builders. What do you think?
Yeah, all of what you just said is spot on, Jerry. Another thing I had hoped to encourage, at least in my state, in Colorado, had I become governor, was a more emphasis on trade schools, specifically on trade schools, charter schools. And you mentioned apprenticeships. I mean, that's the way a whole lot of people, like your father, my father, that's how they learned. Is working side by. They may not have even called it an apprenticeship, but they were working at somebody's elbow and
Yes.
learning a trade. And at least I don't want to. I certainly don't want to appear self-serving, but I do hold in high regard an agrarian background, and I was sincere when I said earlier that my first thought was to get away from that farm as fast as I could, and then realized how good I had it, and I came back to my parents as I was getting ready to graduate from college and said, could I give dairy farming a try with you? I'm so glad I did, because in that doing it yourself, however simple it might seem, getting up at 4 a.m. and going and feeding the cows, if the tractor doesn't start, you got to figure out how to get it running again. Doing that, you build a tremendous amount of self-confidence along with some skills that you'll use again another day. We've got so many people now that, at least in my state, and I'll bet back where you are too, that are trying to run their own small business and are so frustrated because they can't find anybody that's one, willing to work, and two, got the skills to work.
Yeah.
They're glad to take a paycheck, but we've I think erred in educating maybe a couple of generations by now of people that don't have those applicable skills just to do some of the basic work in life. I mean, look who's framing our houses and laying our bricks and
Right.
pouring our concrete. And
When I was a kid, I changed my own oil. My dad and I would give the car a tune-up. I mean, so never mind that. But it's interesting. I think that I coach football. I told you this already, and I would tell hey, do a post route, 7 yards, and then towards the post. And these young men didn't know what a yard was.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding. So I think, look, if we want to make a change for the future, I'm a firm believer in incremental change. Again, like Speaker Gingrich said, one slice at a time. We're not going to change culture, politics overnight, but we can do it incrementally. Small changes, small reforms to get to a bigger reform. And I think we hit on it today. I think rethinking how we educate ourselves, revitalizing the idea of federalism, and also letting young people know, and all people know, that you can start a business, that you can teach yourself to become this or that. I want to be respectful of your time, but I have to ask this. What are some things, though, that are in our way that hurt the startup firm or the rancher or the person who wants to operate a small business? Are there things that we're doing well? Are there things that we're not doing well?
Well, one of the things we're not doing well at all is we're trying to regulate ourselves to death. Taxes are one thing, and they're significant. Access to capital is significant. The cost of it and even the availability of it. But the amount of regulation right now that gets in people's way. We sold our bank. When I say we, Claudia and I, we grew it from that $3 million to about $450 million in a dozen years, and one location to 13 locations. And so we had a good run. But wisely, while I was still in Congress, Claudia decided we were getting overbanked, but especially over-regulated. This is before Dodd-Frank. This is before the big recession years. But she had the wisdom to go ahead and put it on the market, and she rung the bell. She got a good price for it, a very good price. And a lot of people try to flatter us by saying, I wish you were there, your kind of bank, a real community bank oriented to the small business people. Yeah. I wish we could be there too, but I tell them in all candor, we couldn't run a bank today like we ran it then. The small banks are going away because the government regulation, the cost and the demands of trying to do business are so extreme that they simply can't function. So you see the small banks that always took care of Main Street, always took care of those mom and pop businesses because they knew them. You know, they went to church with them. They see them in the grocery store. They raise their kids together. They know those people. It's that kind of bonding that kept communities vital and small business alive. We've just about regulated ourselves out of business, the business of business. I think regulation is a huge one. The education system is certainly part of it. But the demands on business that they keep heaping ever more on, at some point people just say uncle and they go away. They either relocate or they say enough and they're gone.
Yeah, I kid with my wife. We're not going to do this, but whenever we have a frustration with some of the things you're talking about in our lives, I'm like, you know what, kid? Let's sell the house and let's move to Ireland, and I'll run a small pub. But then again,
that sounds pretty attractive, Jerry.
There might be, but there'll be problems with that too. I do think this. You're right about regulation. You're right about these things, but we haven't been able to to kill the entrepreneur. They're still here, and they want to thrive. And I think that's a great hope. I think America is still a place, even in our most regulated places. You know, it used to be like the big cities were a place where you would become a citizen, you would understand diversity in your neighbors, and you could start a business. Cities have changed a little bit, but I remember, and I'll say this and I'll give you the last word. I remember I grew up in the Bronx in the 80s, in the 70s, the bad old days, when when Gerald Ford, President Ford said, you know, Ford to New York, drop dead. And everyone thought cities were now ungovernable. That was the mainstream, both left and right. Cities we can't do it. And then all of a sudden in the 90s, you know, you have policing reform, you have some economic reform, you have a Republican governor in New York, a Republican mayor, a Democrat legislature, and a Democrat city council, and they produced reforms that created 20 years of urban renaissance in this country. So we've done it before, and that's my hope. We only have to look to our past to know what we need to do to change things in the future. We don't have to reinvent anything. It's right in front of us.
That's right.
And I think we can. And I'm encouraged by you and your career and I'm intrigued by ranching. I'm not going to be a rancher. I'm a city boy, but I like the idea of it. To me, land is my backyard. But before we let you go, and this has been wonderful, is there something I didn't ask? Is there something that you want to say, or how can our listeners find out more about your ranch, about what's going on? I have to ask you this. You ought to be writing books. You should be writing articles. You know, I'm the editor, one of the editors over at Real Clear. I'd love to have your voice on our pages talking about common sense and how we can work together, because we're not done yet. Anyway, what's your last word?
Well, you set the table very well, Jerry, and thank you for those flattering words. I have done a little bit of writing. I published a book in 2009 called A Return to Values. And in that was after a pretty tough election or two that the Republicans had been through, and people were saying that the Republican Party was dead. We'd never elect another Republican president, certainly. And we did. I drafted what I called an agenda for America then that I thought was full of common sense. Unfortunately, almost all the issues I addressed, education reform, immigration, trade, our economy certainly, and cultural issues, on and on. Almost all of them are still out there looking for a solution.
Yes.
As you were speaking earlier about the faith in entrepreneurship, the spirit of Americans, I would say, I have that same sense of optimism. I think that's ingrained in our DNA. We say that sometimes and it sounds trivial, but I really think that's part of what America's all about. I hope we haven't extinguished that. And kind of the simple truth that I have learned along the way is what you incentivize, you get more of. What you penalize, you get less of.
Yes.
And with the taxes that we have to pay, but especially the regulation burden, the hurdles that we put in front of people, those are penalties. Those are inhibitors. So it's not surprising that it's more difficult, to do as my dad and granddad did. They wanted to be a farmer, and they just kind of went and did it. There wasn't too much in their way, other than if they did a poor job, couldn't pay their bills. You know what happened then? But they just doubled down and worked hard enough to make it go. We could reform very quickly if we would do that simple analysis. What are we doing as a government? If we can limit it, right now our discussion's kind of been about government, at the state, local level, both state, local, and federal levels. What are we doing that is an inhibitor, a penalty, rather than an incentive for people to, we've got good people. To use a ranching metaphor, drop the reins and let that horse run. Let people have their head and go.
Yeah.
Most people, I grew up believing we're made in the image and likeness of the God that created us. Most people are inherently good and will do the good thing if you give them just enough enough room to do it.
I think you outlined your next book, Drop the Reins.
Drop the reins. Let 'em
That's
go.
a good book. Well, listen, I'm going to be in touch with you, if you don't mind, to talk about maybe something we could do through Real Clear and that sort of thing. This episode, as our viewers know, it'll be up on the Federal Newswire. It'll be presented in different forms and that sort of thing. But again, public servant, entrepreneur, rancher, farmer, husband, dad, granddad. When I talked to you last week, I could hear. I thought I heard some of the grandkids in the background, which is I love. I love big families and that sort of thing. But Bob Beauprez, this has been a wonderful time. I'm blessed to have had this conversation with you. I know our viewers and listeners, the same is true. So thank you for this. I appreciate it very much.
It's been my pleasure, Jerry. God bless you.
God bless you. That's it. Another Business of America. We did well, and we'll see you again next week.
This has been the Federal Newswire's Business of America podcast, hosted by Jerry Rogers. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream